Once they were a Bronze Age superpower, a nation so mighty that Babylon feared them, and even Egypt couldn't bend them to its will. Then they vanished from memory, as if they'd never existed at all. Only faint traces remained in the Bible. Abraham supposedly bought a cave from a Hittite, and God promised Joshua the land of the Hittites. Who were these people? Where did they live? What became of them? Time wiped away the answers. There were the Hittites, and then they were gone. In this video, we'll explore who they were and why their civilization disappeared from history for 3,000 years. The Hittites began migrating into Anatolia in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, though where they originally came from is still unclear. Historians generally point to two main theories. One suggests their ancestors lived in the northern Balkans, but were driven out by new waves of Indo-European peoples. Crossing the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, they eventually reached Asia Minor. The other theory claims that they came from the east, crossing into Anatolia through the Caucasus. Both ideas have their supporters, and the debate continues. But what we do know is that the Hittites ultimately made Anatolia their home. Before they arrived, the region was inhabited by a completely different people, the Hattians. Who they were is still something of a mystery. Their language may have been related to the Abkhaz-Adige family, but the evidence is so fragmentary that no one can say for sure. The Hattians lived in the valley of the Kızılırmak River and had no central government. Instead, their land was made up of independent city-states: Kadesh, Zalpa, Borashanda, Salatiwara, Hattusa, and others, collectively known as the Land of Hatti. The Indo-European migration into this area seems to have been relatively peaceful. Archaeologists haven't found signs of major destruction or burning in Hattian cities. The newcomers settled among the locals, gradually mixing with them and adopting much of their material culture. What they originally called themselves remains uncertain, but the earliest name found in written sources is Neshili, the people of Nessa, referring to the Hattian city of Kadesh. This means the term appeared only after they had already settled in Anatolia. Over time, they took on the Hattian name and became known as the Hittites, while still calling their homeland the Land of Hatti. At the time, Anatolia was dotted with Assyrian trading colonies, the largest of which was in Kadesh. The Assyrians, who were then traders rather than conquerors, brought tin and woolen textiles from the south and exchanged them for silver, gold, and copper. It's from their cuneiform tablets that we get the first mentions of the Hittites, with many clearly Indo-European names appearing on the records. Around 1790 BC, the first known Hittite king, Anitta, the son of Pithana, came to power. From his base in the city of Kusara, he launched campaigns to bring nearby cities and regions under his rule: Nessa, Zalpa, Borashanda, and Salatiwara. After capturing Nessa, also known as Kadesh, Anitta drove out the Assyrian merchants and made it his new capital. A text written in his name has survived to this day, telling the story of his rise and struggle for power. Anitta, son of Pithana, king of Kusara, spoke. This was pleasing to the storm god, and since it was pleasing to the storm god, the king of Nessa became the captive of the king of Kusara. The king of Kusara, at the head of a great army, marched out of the city, and at night, during a storm, took the city of Nessa. He captured the king of Nessa, but did not harm a single inhabitant of the city and treated them like a father. Anitta's account goes on to tell of more battles and conquests, though most of them were small local wars. His army, according to the same text, numbered about 1,400 soldiers and 40 chariots. Yet that was enough to make him the most powerful ruler in Anatolia. In one campaign, he captured Hattusa, the stronghold of the Hattian princes, leveled it to the ground, and cursed it for all time. Ironically, Hattusa would later become the capital of the Hittite Empire. About a century and a half after Anitta, a new king appeared, Labarna, who is often seen as the true founder of the Hittite state. A warrior through and through, Labarna spent most of his reign leading campaigns. Later Hittite chronicles describe his rule like this: "And the land was still small, but wherever he set out on campaign, he subdued his enemies by force. He laid waste to lands and rendered them powerless, and the seas became his borders. And when he returned from his campaigns, each of his sons went to some part of the land to rule there, and great cities were given to them as their possession." If we take the text at face value, Labarna's kingdom stretched from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, covering almost all of Eastern Asia Minor. After each campaign, he returned to Kusara and sent his sons to rule the key cities of the conquered lands. His descendants continued to add his name to their royal titles, much like 15 centuries later, the name Caesar became a title for Roman emperors. Labarna's son, also named Labarna, rebuilt Hattusa despite Anitta's old curse and moved his royal seat there, taking the name Hattusili, meaning man of Hattusa. This move symbolically broke ties with the earlier dynasty of Kusara. Like his predecessors, Hattusili spent much of his reign on campaign. Under his command, the Hittite army crossed the Taurus Mountains for the first time and reached the land of Yamhad, in what is now Syria. The Hittites captured and looted several cities, including Halpa, modern Aleppo, before returning home laden with spoils. Hattusili wrote, "And there was neither beginning nor end to the silver and gold, and I brought their gods to the sun goddess of Arina." The Hittites' most valued spoils of war weren't gold or silver, but statues of foreign gods, which they brought back and installed in their own temples. The more deities they gathered in Hattusa, the stronger they believed their kingdom became. If Napoleon was obsessed with Caesar's legacy, and Caesar dreamed of matching Alexander's glory, then Hattusili's role model was Sargon of Akkad. In his inscriptions, he often compares himself to Sargon, writing, for example, "No one had yet crossed the Euphrates but I. The great king Labarna crossed the river on foot, and my army crossed after me. Likewise, Sargon crossed it and defeated the armies of the city of Haha. But he did nothing to the city of Haha and did not burn it with fire, and the smoke of this city did not rise to the storm god in heaven. But I, the great king Labarna, destroyed the city of Haha, gave it to the fire, and its smoke rose to the storm god in heaven. And I yoked the king of the city of Haha like a draft ox to my chariot." The Hittite state was never a monoethnic kingdom. From its rise to its fall, it remained a patchwork of peoples and languages, a true mosaic of tribes. The Hittite core lived alongside other Indo-European groups like the Palaic and Luvian peoples, as well as the Hurrians, Semites, Hattians, and possibly even tribes related to the Sumerians. What held this diverse mix together was the strong centralized power of the kings of the land of Hatti. The king served as high priest, chief judge, lawgiver, and commander-in-chief all at once. He was called the Great King of Hatti, or Hasu, and was believed to be chosen by the sun goddess of Arina and the storm god Tashub. He personally took part in rituals, sacrifices, and even acts of divination. Still, his power was not absolute. It was limited by a special advisory council known as the Penkus, which included nobles, priests, generals, and regional elites. Major decisions, war, peace, and succession, required the council's approval. Beneath the king were the members of the royal family and the highest officials. They governed provinces, led parts of the army, and often had ambitions of their own, sometimes even for the throne. Many palace conspiracies began among their ranks. The Hittite nobility was ambitious, and the system itself flexible enough to make coups and power struggles a regular feature of politics. Another influential group was the governors of major cities, often drawn from local aristocracy. The Hittite Empire operated on a system of vassalage, conquered lands kept a degree of autonomy but had to pay tribute, provide soldiers, and recognize the authority of the great king. These governors often passed their posts down to their heirs and sometimes ruled almost like independent princes. The backbone of Hittite society was formed by free farmers. They worked the land, raised livestock, served in the militia, and paid taxes. But they weren't without rights. They owned their land, were protected by law, and could even file complaints against local nobles. Hittite archives preserve plenty of cases where such complaints were actually decided in the peasants' favor. Below them were the dependent classes, slaves and laborers tied to royal or temple estates. Hittite slavery was very different from what we see in later classical societies. Slaves could own property, marry without their master's permission, and most importantly, had the legal right to buy their freedom, something that didn't depend on a master's goodwill, as it did in Rome. Most slaves were prisoners of war or descendants of conquered peoples, while debt slavery was almost unheard of. Women in Hittite society also had more rights than in many other ancient cultures. The queen, known as the Tawanana, had her own seal, received foreign envoys, and took part in religious ceremonies, and could even rule in the king's absence. Ordinary women could also own land, make contracts, divorce their husbands, and take cases to court. The Hittite legal code is striking for its humanity. While it was clearly influenced by Hammurabi's code, it was far more lenient. Babylonian law followed the principle of an eye for an eye, but the Hittites preferred fines and compensation. If you killed someone's slave, you had to give the owner 2 in return. Steal a sheep, and you owed 10. Even killing a free person was punished with a fine rather than death. In fact, the death penalty was rarely used at all. Oaths also played a big role in Hittite law, something best shown by this line from one of their legal codes. If someone stole a sheep, let him give back 10 sheep, but if he did not steal, let him take an oath before the gods. In other words, sometimes all it took to clear yourself of suspicion was to swear that you were innocent. Hittite texts often repeat the phrase that they worshipped 1,000 gods and goddesses. And even if that's an exaggeration, it's not by much. More than 800 deities from the Hittite pantheon are known today. This incredible variety reflected the kingdom's ethnic diversity. As they expanded their territory, the Hittites didn't destroy local cults, they absorbed them into their own religion. By recognizing the gods of conquered peoples, the Hittites showed respect and strengthened their legitimacy in the eyes of their new subjects. The gods of the Hattians, Hurrians, Luwians, and even cities of Mesopotamia coexisted peacefully in Hittite temples alongside Indo-European deities, and with each other. At the top of the pantheon stood 2 great figures, the storm god Tarhunt, or Teshub, and the sun goddess of Arina. The storm god was often shown holding a hammer and a bundle of lightning bolts, sometimes standing on the back of a bull, a symbol of fertility and power. His cult was especially important in the mountainous regions, where harvests depended on rain. The sun goddess of Arina was seen as the protector of the royal family and the chief deity of Hattusa. Another key figure in the pantheon was the Hattian mother goddess Hanahana. Hittite religion was highly structured and well organized. The king himself served as the high priest, regarded as the earthly representative of the gods. Beneath him was a complex hierarchy of priests, from temple attendants to high priests dedicated to individual deities. Temples were not only places of worship, but also major economic centers. They owned large estates, herds of livestock, and workshops as well. Scribes working in the temples often kept detailed records and copied religious texts. Some temples, like the Great Temple of the Storm God in Hattusa, were vast architectural complexes with many buildings. Hittite mythology was a rich mix of Indo-European, Hattian, and Hurrian traditions. At its core was the myth of the storm god's battle with the dragon Iluyanka, a classic story of order struggling against chaos. Equally fascinating is the Hurrian cycle of Kumarbi, which tells the story of how generations of gods succeeded one another. Many scholars see it as a forerunner of Hesiod's Greek theogony. In these tales, Kumarbi overthrows his father Anu, only to be defeated later by the storm god. While most ancient civilizations relied on peasant militias, the Hittites built out a professional standing army. At the heart of their military power were war chariots. Heavier than their Egyptian counterparts, Hittite chariots were drawn by 2 horses and crewed by 3 men, a driver, an archer, and a spearman. These were the tanks of the ancient world, large, sturdy vehicles where one man handled the horses, another fired arrows, and the third struck nearby enemies with a spear, shielding his comrades when needed. By ancient standards, the Hittite infantry was mostly light. The typical soldier's main weapon was a long spear. They wore light, loose clothing and were usually equipped with only a spear, a helmet, and a shield. They fought in tight formations that in some ways foreshadowed the later Greek phalanx, a formation strong enough to hold off even chariot attacks. Their helmets were bronze and conical in shape, while their shields were small, rectangular or oval, woven and covered with animal hide. As time went on, swords became more common, first made of bronze, then of iron. Hittite soldiers also used battle axes, daggers, and curved sickle-shaped swords inspired by Egyptian designs. Archers made up a large part of the army as well. The Hittites were among the first peoples to master large-scale production of iron weapons. While much of the world still fought with bronze swords and spears, Hittite warriors carried iron blades. They even experimented with iron armor, though bronze armor remained standard for a long time because its production methods were already well developed. However, iron weapons at the time didn't offer much of an advantage over bronze, since ironworking technology was still in its early stages. Early blacksmiths hadn't yet mastered tempering or learned how to control the carbon content in the metal, and the iron ore they minted from open pits was often poor in quality. Bronze production, by contrast, had been refined for more than 1,500 years, so high-quality bronze weapons were still better, and the Hittite elite continued to favor bronze arms and armor. Iron's real advantage was its availability. Iron is about 10 times more common in nature than copper and 100 times more common than tin, both of which are needed to make bronze. This abundance allowed the Hittites to arm much larger forces. Even better, they controlled their own iron deposits and didn't have to rely on imports from other regions. After Hattusili I, the throne passed to his grandson, Mursili I. Interestingly, it wasn't his son but his grandson who inherited the throne. While Hattusili was away fighting in Syria, his sons rebelled in the capital Hattusa. When he returned, the king crushed the revolt, disowned his sons, and named Mursili his successor. This would become a recurring pattern in Hittite history. Whenever the king went off to war, rebellion tended to break out at home. More than half of Hatti's rulers didn't die natural deaths, but fell victim to palace intrigues. Mursili continued his grandfather's policy of expansion. He marched back into Syria and finally brought the kingdom of Yamhad under Hittite control. Like many Hittite wars, this one was driven by economics. After the Assyrian merchants were expelled, tin, essential for making bronze, was imported mainly through Yamhad. Mursili wanted those trade routes under his control. His most dramatic achievement, however, was a daring campaign against Babylon. After marching nearly 2,000 kilometers, Mursili's army captured and plundered the greatest and wealthiest city in Mesopotamia. The Amorite dynasty soon collapsed, and Babylon passed into Kassite hands, a story we've already covered in our video on the history of Babylon. The Hittites returned from Babylon with an enormous haul, large amounts of gold and silver, precious works of art, and statues of Babylonian gods, including a colossal figure of Marduk himself. On the way back, Mursili scored another victory, defeating the Hurrians who tried to seize his loot. But when he returned to Hattusa, Mursili quickly fell victim to a plot led by his father-in-law, Hantili. His reign was short, and Hantili's was even shorter. Unpopular with the nobility, he too was soon murdered. What followed was a period of chaos, a rapid succession of kings, each ruling briefly before meeting a violent end. The root of this instability lay in the Hittite system of royal succession, which allowed nearly any male relative of the king to claim the throne. King Telepinu tried to end the turmoil by issuing an edict that clearly set out the rules of inheritance. From then on, the crown was to pass first to the king's legitimate sons, if none were living, then to sons by concubines, and only as a last resort, to the husbands of royal daughters. But even this reform couldn't save Telepinu. Not long after, he too was murdered. After his death, the old Hittite kingdom fell into decline. Civil strife weakened the state while neighboring powers and tribes grew stronger. Hattusa's influence faded quickly. In Syria and northern Mesopotamia, the kingdom of Mitanni rose to dominance, while along the southern coast of the Black Sea, the warlike Kaska tribes appeared, launching constant raids on Hittite lands and even managing to capture and plunder Hattusa itself. The depth of this crisis is revealed in a letter from Pharaoh Amenhotep III to the king of Arzawa. In it, the Egyptian ruler flatly states that the land of Hatti no longer exists and addresses the king of Arzawa as the most powerful ruler in Asia Minor, a striking change since Arzawa had once been a Hittite vassal. The decline lasted for nearly a century until 1344 BC, when a ruler came to the Hittite throne who would restore the kingdom's former glory, Suppiluliuma I. When he took power, the Hittite state was a shadow of its past, far weaker than the great powers of the time, Egypt and Mitanni. But Suppiluliuma managed to breathe new life into the kingdom and restore its status as a major force in the ancient world. In the early years of his reign, he focused on strengthening royal authority and rebuilding the army. Once his power was secure, he turned north to deal with the Kaska tribes, who had tormented the Hittites for generations. Suppiluliuma's army crushed the Kaska coalition, driving them away from Hittite territory and finally bringing peace to the northern frontier. With the north secure, he turned east. Suppiluliuma campaigned against the kingdoms of Hattusa and Suwa, defeated them, and turned them into vassal states. Around the same time, he forged an alliance with Kizzuwatna, a wealthy kingdom with a mixed Hittite-Luwian population. The Hittites' growing power didn't go unnoticed by another great regional state, Mitanni. Its king, Tushratta, struck back, launching a campaign to retake Assuwa and then invading Syria and Kizzuwatna. He seized the Kilikian Gates, the only practical pass through the Taurus Mountains, effectively blocking the Hittites from advancing south. Suppiluliuma chose a different strategy. Leading his army, he bypassed the Taurus Mountains through the lands of Hattusa and Assuwa, crossed the Euphrates, and struck the Mitannians where they least expected it. Most of Mitanni's forces were concentrated in the north, guarding the Kilikian Gates, and in the south, facing the Egyptians. The Hittite army met almost no resistance as it swept into the undefended heartland of Mitanni. One city after another fell and was plundered. There was no decisive battle. King Tushratta fled, abandoning his capital. It was a total collapse. Caught off guard, the Mitannian troops were demoralized and barely fought back. After marching through barren lands, the Hittite army reached the Mediterranean, stopping only at the walls of Kadesh, a city under Egyptian influence that put up fierce resistance. But after bringing in reinforcements, the Hittites managed to take it too. Suppiluliuma proudly proclaimed, "From the Euphrates to the sea, all the land is mine." Despite the devastation and the loss of its Syrian territories, Mitanni survived, for a time. But Tushratta lost the support of the military elite, and a civil war broke out that dragged on for years. the Hittites cleverly backed first one side, then the other, deepening the divide. Mitanni soon began to crumble. Assyria, once a Mitannian vassal, seized the opportunity to rise. In the end, Mitanni effectively ceased to exist, and the Hittites secured firm control over northern and central Syria. Alongside his military victories, Suppiluliuma also strengthened Hatti through diplomacy. During his reign, several neighboring kingdoms fell under Hittite influence, becoming vassal states. Among them, Kizzuwatna, Lucca, Hyassa, Isua, Arzawa, and Wilusa, better known as the legendary Troy, sung about by Homer. These alliances expanded the borders of the Hittite world, created a secure buffer around its core, and greatly enhanced Suppiluliuma's prestige as a ruler whose influence reached far beyond Anatolia. The height of his diplomatic success, and clear proof of Hatti's growing power, came with almost completed dynastic alliance with Egypt. After the death of Tutankhamun, his young widow, Ankhesenamun, was left as the only surviving member of the royal family. Egypt's military and priestly elites pressured her to marry someone from the local nobility, but unwilling to wed a man of lower rank, she turned to Suppiluliuma, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her. It was an unprecedented request, an Egyptian queen inviting a foreign prince to take the throne of Egypt. Suppiluliuma was cautious and suspected a trap. Even so, he eventually agreed and sent his son Zenanza to Egypt. But the bold diplomatic move ended in tragedy. Soon after arriving, Zenanza was killed in a coup organized by the Egyptian elite who refused to accept a foreigner as their king. Suppiluliuma saw it as an act of treachery, convinced the Egyptians had deliberately lured his son to his death. The murder of Zenanza brought relations between the two great powers of the Bronze Age to a breaking point. After Suppiluliuma's death, Egypt set out to reclaim its lost influence in Syria. Cities like Halpa, Damascus, and Kadesh were valuable prizes. Whoever controlled them held the crossroads of trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe. The young Pharaoh Ramses II, newly crowned and eager for glory, longed for a true military triumph. Egyptian artists were already depicting him as a god of war, and court poets were already celebrating victories that hadn't even happened yet. But Ramses needed a real one. Syria was the perfect target, both strategically and economically. Without it, Egypt lost access to northern Mesopotamia and the vital caravan routes that fueled its power. The Hittite king Muwatalli II, however, had no intention of giving up Syria without a fight. In fact, he hoped to push even further south into the rich lands of Phoenicia and Canaan. War was inevitable. Both sides spent 2 years preparing for it. Ramesses assembled an army of about 20,000 men, a huge force for the time, divided into 4 divisions named after the gods Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Each division had around 5,000 soldiers, hundreds of chariots, and various support units. Muwatalli raised an army to match. He united 19 allies, from Anatolian tribes to Syrian city-states, and brought together 40,000 infantry and 3,500 chariots, the largest army ever fielded in Hittite history. In May of 1274 BC, the Egyptian army reached the city of Kadesh. Local Shasu tribesmen told Ramses that the Hittite army was far to the north, near Halpa, but it was a trap. The Shasu had been sent by the Hittites themselves. In reality, Muwatalli's army was camped nearby, ready to strike. Trusting the false report, Ramses made a serious mistake. He split his forces. Leading the Amun division himself, he advanced far ahead and set up camp near the city. The Ra division followed behind, while the Ptah and Set divisions were still a full day's march away. Once the camp was ready, Ramesses sent messengers to summon the rest of his troops, planning to join forces and begin the siege of Kadesh. But the Hittites struck first. From his camp on the opposite side of the river, Muwatalli ordered an attack on the Ra division before it could reach Ramesses. 2,500 Hittite chariots crossed the river and smashed into the Egyptian column stretched out for several kilometers. Caught completely off guard, the soldiers of the Ra division had no time to form up and were quickly overwhelmed. Many panicked and fled, abandoning their weapons, and most were cut down. Only a few chariots managed to reach Ramesses' camp. After crushing the Ra division, the Hittite chariots regrouped and charged straight into the Egyptian camp. Egyptian infantry tried to hold the line, but the fight was hopelessly uneven. Foot soldiers couldn't stand against fast, heavily armed chariots. The Hittites broke through the defenses, stormed into the camp, and set it on fire. Fierce fighting erupted among the burning tents, where the chariots' movement was limited, but their attack was still devastating. Before long, the Egyptian troops began to falter and retreat in panic. To the Hittites, it seemed the battle was already won. Ramesses was in a desperate situation, but he still had troops left to fight. He gathered his personal guard of Sheridan mercenaries, rallied all of the remaining chariots, and personally led a counterattack. Egyptian records claim he fought like a god, that arrows bounced off his body and his chariot rode over the fallen enemy. The exaggeration is obvious here, but the counterattack itself, which turned the tide of the battle, was real. Ramesses circled around the camp and struck the Hittite chariots from behind. The Hittite warriors, already busy looting the Egyptian camp, were caught completely off guard. Lacking discipline, they couldn't regroup, and it cost them the battle. The Egyptian counterattack revived the morale of the infantry, which began to fight back in an organized way. Nearly surrounded, the Hittite charioteers broke ranks and fled. Across the river, King Muwatalli II watched the chaos unfold. Seeing his chariots in retreat, he sent the rest of his chariots across the river and launched another assault on the Egyptian camp, where the Amun division once again bore the brunt of the fighting. The battle was fierce, and for a time the Hittites seemed to have the upper hand. Then the situation suddenly changed. A contingent of Niaran, Egyptian reinforcements, and mercenaries who had been ordered by Ramesses to link up with the main army arrived and struck Muwatalli's chariots at the flank. At the same moment, Ramesses returned to the camp after breaking off his pursuit of the fleeing Hittites. Seeing the tide turn, Muwatalli ordered a retreat and pulled his troops back across the river. The next day, both sides agreed to a truce. Both sides told the story their own way. The Egyptians claimed that Ramesses had won the greatest victory in history. Temples were decorated with grand reliefs of his heroism, and court poets filled the halls with hymns to his glory. The Hittites, meanwhile, declared that they had utterly crushed the Egyptians, capturing their camp and taking thousands of prisoners. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Tactically, the Hittites had the upper hand. They struck first, nearly destroyed 2 Egyptian divisions, and held the city. But they also suffered heavy losses and were in no position to continue the campaign. Most importantly, both sides realized that more fighting would change nothing. Negotiations dragged on for 15 years, until in 1259 BC, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed the world's first known peace treaty. Copies were placed in temples at Thebes and Hattusa. The treaty's terms were remarkably advanced for its time. It confirmed borders and spheres of influence, established a non-aggression pact, promised mutual defense against external threats, and even included clauses on extradition and royal succession. The agreement became a milestone in the history of diplomacy. Today, a copy of it hangs at the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of peaceful conflict resolution. Syria was divided. The north remained under Hittite control while the south went to Egypt. A lasting peace followed. Trade flourished. Caravans moved freely between Hattusa and Thebes, and Egyptian gold was exchanged for Hittite iron. The alliance was sealed with a royal marriage. Ramesses married the daughter of Hattusili III. A stalemate on the battlefield had become one of the greatest diplomatic triumphs of the Bronze Age. The Hittite kingdom began to unravel in the 13th century BC, during the reigns of its last great kings. The warning signs were already clear: political infighting, a worsening climate, growing competition for resources, and mounting pressure from outside peoples. The final collapse came during the broader crisis known as the Late Bronze Age Collapse, a massive upheaval that swept across nearly every civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean. If you missed it, we did a video about that not too long ago. Around 1200 BC, the empire's capital Hattusa was destroyed and never rebuilt. Archaeology paints a grim picture: cities reduced to ruins, construction halted, and a central authority gone. Unlike Egypt, which managed to preserve its statehood, the Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. What followed was a 200-year dark age, about which we know almost nothing. The royal records fall silent, diplomatic letters stop, and the archaeological evidence shows a dramatic decline in population throughout the region. New peoples soon appeared in the former Hittite lands. In central Anatolia, the Phrygians arrived, gradually absorbing the remaining inhabitants and bringing their own culture. Along the Syrian coast, a few cities continued to exist, nominally Hittite, but in reality part of a new world. These so-called Syro-Hittite kingdoms preserved bits of Hittite culture, but the written language was now Luvian rather than Hittite. Even the nature of writing changed. Myths, religious texts, and royal chronicles vanished, replaced by short, dedicatory, and commemorative inscriptions. In official correspondence, Akkadian became the dominant language. The Hittite religion also changed dramatically. The old Hittite gods were replaced first by Hurrian deities, and later by those of Assyria. Even the remaining elites no longer identified with their ancient culture. The last Hittite cities, places like Kamath and Carchemish, resisted the advancing Assyrians for a while, but one by one they fell. The Assyrians deported the population and resettled them throughout their empire. By 700 BC, the last of the Syro-Hittite kingdoms were gone. This was the collapse of an entire cultural, linguistic, and historical tradition. The Hittite language disappeared forever. Their writing was forgotten. Even the memory of the Hittites faded from the region. Centuries later, the early Greeks didn't even remember them, apart from a single vague line in the Iliad mentioning Trojan allies like the Cheti, whose identity was already lost. Only fragments of Hittite tradition survived the centuries of darkness, reshaped beyond recognition. A few of their gods lived on in new forms. The storm god Tarhu became Hercules of Tarsus. Kubaba evolved into the Greco-Phrygian Cybele, and Teshub entered the Urartian pantheon as Tesheba. But these were only faint echoes, stripped of their original meaning. The memory of the Hittites would remain buried for millennia, until the 20th century when archaeology and the deciphering of their texts finally brought them back to life. The Hittites were one of the three great civilizations of the Bronze Age Near East, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. Their disappearance is a powerful reminder that even the mightiest and most advanced culture can vanish without a trace once its infrastructure collapses, its writing is lost, and the thread of its traditions is broken. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. We put out new episodes every single week. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.